Here comes Ruth chapter 2. So Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a prominent and wealthy member of Elimelech's clan, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the woman from Moab, said to Naomi, "Let me go into the field and glean ears of grain behind anyone who will allow me to." And she answered her, "Go, my daughter." And so she set out and arrived at the field and gleaned behind the reapers. And she happened to be in the part of the field that belonged to Boaz from Elimelech's clan. And when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the reapers, "Yehovah be with you." And they answered him, "Yehovah bless you." Then Boaz asked his servant supervising the reapers, "Whose girl is this?" And the servant supervising the reapers answered, "She's a girl from Moab who returned with Naomi from the plain of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather what falls from the sheaves behind the reapers." And so she went and has kept at it from morning until now, except for a little rest in the shelter. Boaz said to Ruth, "Behold, listen carefully. Don't go to glean in another field. Don't leave this place, but stick here with my working girls. Keep your eyes on whichever field the reapers are working in, and follow the girls. I've ordered the young men not to bother you. Whenever you get thirsty, go and drink from the water jars the young men have filled." She fell on her face, prostrating herself, and said to him, "Why are you showing me such favor? Why are you paying attention to me? I'm only a foreigner." Boaz said to her, "I've heard the whole story, everything you've done for your mother-in-law since your husband died, including how you left your father and mother and the land you were born in to come to a people about whom you knew nothing beforehand. May Yehovah reward you for what you have done. May you be rewarded in full by Yehovah, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." She said, "My Lord, I hope to continue pleasing you. You have comforted and encouraged me, even though I'm not one of your servants." When mealtime came, Boaz said to her, "Come here, have something to eat, and dip your piece of bread in the olive oil and vinegar." And she sat by the reapers, and they passed her some roasted grain. She ate till she was full, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her glean even among the sheaves themselves, without making her feel ashamed. In fact, pull some ears of grain out from the sheaves on purpose. Leave them for her to glean, and don't rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. When she beat out what she had gathered, it came to about 40 to 50 pounds of barley. She picked it up and went back to the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and Ruth brought out and gave her what she had left over after eating her fill. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? From where were you working? Blessed be the one who took such good care of you." She told her mother-in-law with whom she had been working, and she said, "The name of the man with whom I was working today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by Yehovah, who has never stopped showing grace, neither to the living nor to the dead." Naomi also told her, "The man is closely related to us. He's one of our redeeming kinsmen." Ruth, the woman from Moab, said, "Moreover, he even said to me, 'Stay close to my young men until they've finished my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, for you to keep going out with his girls so that you won't be encountering hostility in some other field." So she stayed close to Boaz's girls to glean until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, it's so challenging for me to plumb all the depths of this section. I mean, I know if you've been with us for any time that you can see, hopefully you're starting to see below the surface, and you're seeing all these details. Sometimes you're seeing repetition in the text. Sometimes you're hearing words and phrases that you've heard before, and you're beginning to think to yourself, there's something deeper going on here than just a love story in the fields of Bethlehem. And there's some prophetic things, and there's some really closely related issues to things that have happened before. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into this section before we close out chapter 2, because we didn't really have a whole bunch of time last time to deal with some of these elements that may indeed be allegorical. So let's deal with that just a little bit. The first thing that I want to bring to your attention is that it says that she went among the fields to see if someone would allow her to glean. So if gleaning is a commandment of the Torah, why is she seeking for someone who will actually allow it to happen? What do you think about that?
Well, perhaps maybe there was, even though it's available for people to glean from the fields, maybe there was some hostility of her not being really one of them.
That's a good insight. Absolutely, she might have been encountering some resistance because she's a foreigner. That's certainly possible. Yes, Gracie?
Well, if she had never done before like this, and she'd never been into their culture before,
Yeah.
it would be new for her, and she would possibly want to make sure that she's getting permission or
Sure.
letting them know who she is and what she needs. And,
Yeah.
you know.
And that's just good manners, to go out there and talk to them and say, I'd like to do this. What do you guys remember about that Torah commandment about, reaping to the edges of your field? Who is it for? Do you remember?
The stranger, right?
The stranger, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan. So she definitely falls into that category. It's also possible, it seems to me, that there may be a theme that's in play here where we're talking about a faithful remnant. But remember that this section of the Bible is happening during the period of the Judges. And what did we say about the period of the Judges? What is that characterized by? Every man doing what is right in his own eyes. So it's certainly possible that she might have encountered all kinds of hostility in the field because injustice was happening everywhere, that they were not following the Torah, that they were, they're going to tell you, get out of my field, what do you think you're doing? And I think it's possible that she knew what she was looking for. Perhaps she knew a little bit about the Torah, maybe not, I'm not sure, but she knew that she had the ability to do this, and she was looking for someone who would allow it. And when she found it, this was confirmed for her, I believe, when Boaz, the owner of the field, shows up, and what does he say? Yehovah be with you. And his reapers say, Yehovah bless you. So I think that this is almost like a confirmatory oath that she found what she was looking for. She found a faithful remnant of Israel. Tracy?
And this is after she says to Naomi, your God will be my God.
Right.
So perhaps, Naomi has filled her in on this God. Otherwise, why would she be saying,
Right.
So she might have that back information that she's going
Yeah.
looking for
Yeah.
this God.
Yeah, I thought about that too, and I'm torn, frankly, about whether she had some information, because Boaz, says to her, well, you came here among this people among you whom you knew nothing, but that may just be a figure of speech. I would assume she knew something about, her husband and her brother-in-law and her father-in-law before they died. Hopefully they had some inkling of religion in their lives. You would certainly hope so. But it just occurs to me that this story, I think obviously since it's told from the perspective of some descendant of David hundreds of years later, likely, that they're seeking to demonstrate amongst themselves that they are a faithful remnant. Remember, this is a political piece, and we talked about that right when we started, that this was a piece of literature that was written by the descendants of King David, probably as a political piece to show their legitimacy as a rightful, having righteousness in their background and being a faithful remnant. And I think that plays into this story. Now, so I think that there is that idea of a faithful remnant. Now, taking a look at finding a deeper meaning in these scriptural texts that we read a lot of times. Now, I know that if you've been with us for any length of time, you've probably seen this PaRDeS thing. Has anyone remember this? Do you remember what PaRDeS stands for? Okay, so PaRDeS is literally where we get the word paradise. It literally means paradise. And this is the paradise of finding meaning in the Torah. And so, what does the P stand for? Pashat, which means the surface level. What does it say right on the top of the surface of the text? This is how most of us read books. I was going to share this with you. From the time that I was, I remember when I was in second grade, I started just voraciously devouring books. When it was recess time, you'd find me out under a tree reading a book. I just loved reading. And I read up until the time that I was starting college. I read hundreds of books of all different kinds, classic texts, and I always read books for this pure enjoyment and just the surface level. What's happening in the story? Just tell me the action and who loves who and who's doing what, and I thought it was great. But then I went to college, and my professors were like, you realize that there's something underneath it on another level. I was like, no, there's not. And now some of the stuff they were bringing out was frankly stupid. But I began to discover that even in secular literature, obviously there are metaphors and allegories going on, and they introduced me to other ways of interpreting literature to see different meanings underneath the text where things become symbols, and that was a fantastic eye-opening discovery. I had no idea about this, and I had read all my life. But then when I found out about this is something completely different. I've never ever read even some of the mystical texts that the world has to offer have nothing like this, the way the Bible does this. It's quite fascinating. And so P is for Peshat, which means the surface level. What is R? Remez, that is correct. And what do you understand that to mean? That's where you start seeing these metaphors and these similes and this allegory where this thing might represent something else. And then the D, Darash, which means hint, or inquiry. And usually, if you are familiar at all with Rabbi David Foreman from Aleph Beta, he does this a lot, and he has this little phrase that he loves to say, where have we heard this before? This is where you can gain some really interesting insights when you see something in the story and you're like, man, this sounds remarkably similar to another story, and then you compare those two things and and it brings out an even deeper meaning. You see a connection. You're like, wow, this piece informs that piece, and this piece informs that piece, and it starts to, take on bigger meaning. And then S, we all know that one. Sod, which means mystery. This is way below the surface, and this often has to do with the Hebrew letters. Things that are buried in the text itself. It could be some Hebrew gematria where you're like counting the letters, and now some of it gets a little bit weird, but there's some pretty amazing things here and there. I'm sure that you guys have heard about the throwing the net into the sea and pulling out 153 fish, right? What does 153 symbolize? Why did they throw that number in there? So there's definitely something to that. So those are the 4 levels that a traditional Hebrew scholar would follow in order to plumb the depths of a piece of Scripture. And I want us to do that for just a couple of minutes with this passage in chapter 2. Angela?
You have to do those in order.
Yeah,
You can't skip.
you don't have to do them in order?
No, you do.
You do. Now, why do you say that? Is that your opinion?
No. That's what they say.
That's what they say?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if I agree with that, but I'll take your word for it.
I think you need to understand the surface level. I think there's a process.
Oh, yes, I totally agree. I think it would be foolish to skip what the text says on the plain surface, and decide, okay, I'm not really interested in what it says on the surface. I'm really interested in the secret mysteries.
Because if you haven't understood the framework that you're dealing with, you're going to go to Sod and you're going to come up with some really whacked out stuff.
Okay, yes, in that respect, I would say that's
a...
yeah.
Whatever you find on the other 3 levels has to agree with the surface level. It cannot change.
Now that is a really good insight, and in case you didn't hear her, she said, you don't want to skip around if you haven't understood these things on one level at a time, and from that perspective, I think that's a good insight. You can't, these things build upon each other. They are like layers and foundations, and I totally agree with that. Tracy?
2 things actually that's kind of interesting in that, without understanding, is that a lot of people want to just understand Revelation without going to Genesis first. So if you think of that as the PaRDeS
Absolutely.
process,
Absolutely.
these are mysteries you cannot possibly know unless
Yeah.
you go back to the beginning.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
also Messiah tells his disciples, which are students of him. So if you're a disciple, you have to start at the bottom. You have to start at the beginning and let him guide you.
Right.
And he says, unto you, disciple, it is given to know the mysteries of the
Right.
kingdom, but to them it is not given. So
Right.
we're working toward that
Yep.
greater understanding, but you have to start at the beginning in order to get there.
Excellent insight. And I think in regards to your first point, which was...
Genesis,
Yes, I have heard some teacher say, I don't remember who it was, but he says that the book of Revelation is like Grand Central Station for prophecy. It's like, you can't start here. You really need to start here around all the outside prophets, because everything seems to come together in the book of the Revelation. So you don't start there.
And he even says, something like, I revealed the end from the beginning.
Yeah.
That's the scripture I'm talking
Right,
about,
right.
I determined the end from the beginning.
Yeah, somewhere in Isaiah, I think that is. But your second point regarding the Messiah, teaching his disciples and really internalizing these things and being a student of the Word. I heard something this last week, I was watching a video with my sons from Ray Vanderlaan. Fantastic guy. Have any of you guys ever listened to Ray Vanderlaan? If you ever get your hands on some of that stuff, it's quite good. He takes large study groups to Israel, and they close off the monuments. I don't know how he does this, but he'll have all these different. He'll go to Egypt and look at the temples in Egypt when he's teaching about the book of the Genesis and the Exodus narratives. He'll go up to Turkey and visit the ruins of these churches in Asia Minor that Paul's writing about. He's traveling all over Israel. And he seems to have full and unfettered access to all these places, because when they're filming, it's in the middle of the day and there's no one around. They've got the place roped off, and he's got a big group of people, and he's teaching them the Bible in context of right there where it happened. And he's very, very good. But he said, in regards to the disciples, in the Hebrew culture, the Hebrew mindset in this regard is very, very different than the Greek culture. Like if you took and you wanted to follow a Stoic philosopher or something, I want to know what you know. With the Hebrew, it's not like that at all. It's I want to be what you are. They followed Yeshua and followed him all day, every day. And he shows this, and he goes through the rabbinic writings and the New Testament writings and the Old Testament writings to show that a Hebrew disciple is with his rabbi all day, every day. They sleep where he sleeps, they eat what he eats, they go wherever he goes, because they want to be like him, not just know what he knows. That's a big difference.
You're just describing the whole garden situation.
Yes.
Because Satan's saying, he knows you're going to be like him.
Yeah.
You're going to know what he knows.
Yep.
But then Messiah comes and say, I'll show you how to be like me.
Right.
You're not just going to be like me. You have to walk as I walk.
Yep. And that's a huge problem for a lot of us, and I would include myself in that, is basically wanting to know things. That's my Greek heritage and background that gets in my way continuously, where I want to know stuff, but it's much harder for me to integrate it into my life and to be something. You know what I'm saying? And that's been a problem for a lot of the followers of the Messiah, is wanting to know things but not be a follower of the Messiah. That's really challenging. And so that's something that we all struggle with. And I'll encourage you in that regard. So let's get started with this little PaRDeS thing, okay? So I think that we have basically demonstrated that on the Peshat level, this is a fairly simple story about King David's ancestors. Now, we know that there's some hidden things, and we'll get to those, but on the surface level, it's a political narrative about King David's ancestors being portrayed as righteous individuals, having a heart to follow God. Angela?
It's a love story.
A love story. Yep, absolutely. So that's the basic level. And then at level 2 is where you start to think about these people, places, and things and events that happen, and you begin to think about what might these things symbolize. And we just mentioned some of these things at the end of our study last week, And I asked you if you had opportunity this week to read through this thing a couple times and begin to think about these ideas. And I put a couple of these ideas up here for you with what does Ruth symbolize? What does Boaz symbolize? What do these fields symbolize? What does gleaning perhaps symbolize? The reapers, the maidens, the sheaves. I know that we have, and this is beginning to get into, this crosses over into the Darash, and we'll get to that in a second, but it starts to cross over because you begin to think about these things and think, well, where have I heard some of these phrases before, like sheaves and maidens and reapers and gleaning, okay? But they're symbolic perhaps of something else. Anybody want to pick out any one of these particular concepts, people, places, or things, and make a comment about that, about what your insight might be regarding some of the things that these things might symbolize?
Are we thinking that any of this might be around the features based on a time period in the book?
Very possibly, yes. There's definitely some elements of There's definitely some elements of the Passover, because it mentions a couple of times about the barley harvest. That makes me automatically think of the Passover. It makes me think of Shavuot because it talks about the grain harvest. In fact, you might have asked yourself if you didn't know this, but the Book of Ruth is read in Jewish synagogues on Shavuot.
I was kind of thinking Shavuot because of the harvest, and the Shavuot's like this picture of the covenant, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the word is given, it's when the Spirit is given, and now we've got this kind of union taking place.
Yeah.
As well as Boaz.
Yeah, absolutely. Angela?
The sheaves makes me think of Rahab, where she went to get the spies on a roof.
That's
And
good.
Rahab, I think, is Boaz's mother. Something like that.
Yeah, there was some kind of a connection there. I remember talking with you about that a while back. That apparently Rahab in the Jewish mythology, legends, probably somewhere. I don't know that it's in the Torah. I didn't see anything in the Torah about that. But in the Jewish tradition, Rahab married one of the. What's that? Salmon, which was an ancestor of Judah. No, it wasn't an ancestor of Judah. It was one of the sons, not sons of Judah, but a descendant of PaRDeS, right? I think that's who it was.
But he was Boaz's dad, and that is in Ruth at the end.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right, because it gives you the genealogy. So, yes, apparently, yes. And so that's a good insight. The sheaves that she hid on the roof with the spies underneath them, that's a good insight. She was a Gentile who made herself part of Israel. That's a good insight, yeah.
I think I found it, Matthew 1:5, and salmon begat, well, they spell it booze, but I think it's supposed to be Boaz.
Booze.
Of Rahab. So it's
Yeah.
like, they also are giving the female,
Right,
and Boaz begat Obed of Ruth.
right,
So
right.
that's where that comes from. And Obed begat Jesse, so that David comes
So
And
it's
there are only a few women mentioned in that genealogy in Matthew, and Rahab and Ruth.
yeah, it's quite fascinating that you have two Gentile women who were grafted into Israel in the genealogy of the Messiah. Big theme. Big theme in this book, obviously.
And one was a prostitute, and the other one was a Moabite. Horrible.
Horrible.
That's not supposed to happen.
That is not supposed to happen, yes, on either case. A Moabite and a prostitute.
Like fallen mankind.
That's right. So that's good insight. What else do you guys think of? What would you say that Ruth, as her as one of the key figures of this story, symbolizes? Gentiles, absolutely. I think that one, that smacks you right inside the face. The ingrafting of the Gentiles, Ruth being a perfect representative of a Gentile. What about Boaz?
Kinsman Redeemer, or are you going, is this the level we're talking about? With
Absolutely, yeah. I think as a kinsman redeemer, he's a perfect picture of the Messiah, Yeshua. And I think you want to remember that in the New Testament and the Old Testament, we have different words used for the exact same concept, which is what we would consider today to be salvation. Like in the Greek, we have this word that's translated as saved. He shall be saved. In the Hebrew, it's redeemed. The words saved and redeemed in the New and the Old Testament are equivalent. They mean the same thing. And that gives you some good, keen insight and wisdom into this whole concept of being a saved person, being a redeemed person. So that's a big one right there. And Ruth being redeemed, Naomi being also be redeemed by this great man, this kinsman redeemer, is a beautiful picture of the Messiah. Beautiful picture of the Messiah there. Anything else? What else do you think about? What do you think about reapers? Where have we heard this before? We're starting to dip into the drosh level just a little bit, but what about reapers? Where have you heard that phrase before? Jerry?
I've heard it in Matthew 24.
There you go. Exactly. No, that's exactly what I was thinking. I wasn't looking for it, but that's what I was thinking, and there might be other ones. But yes, in the Gospel of Matthew, at the end of the Gospel, it's talking about the angels being sent out as reapers, separating the wheat and the chaff, the sheep and the goats.
And that's the wheat and the tares parable as well.
Right.
The reapers, and then in Revelation again, the angels are the reapers.
Right. And I think what's interesting also, if you look at the sheaves, this might be slightly a bit of a stretch, but I want to throw it out there anyway. It reminded me of our reading in Romans chapter 11 a couple of weeks ago, where you've got this tree and branches are broken off so that these Gentiles can be grafted in. In these bundles, parts of them are not broken off, but removed from the bundle so that Ruth can gather get involved in this gathering of the harvest. It's a similar concept. It's not real straight up, but it just made me think of it. So that's something to think about. What are the fields? I mean, this one is a big one in the Gospels. What do fields represent?
Oh, I think it's the same as the parables about the fields in Matthew.
Yes, right. In Matthew,
It's basically the earth where
yeah, it's the earth, it's the world, it's the peoples of the world. Absolutely. So, and then that kind of, and we're going to hit on this slightly separately in a moment, but I want you to just keep this in your mind. There's a lot of emphasis placed in this section on do not go to any other field. Now, if we take that metaphor to be the world, what is he saying? Don't leave this planet and go to another planet? No, not quite. But think about that for a second. And I'm going to bring something to your attention in a few minutes. But just consider that in the back of your mind. What does this mean? Stay in this field. Don't go to another field. We'll think about that in a second. Now, I want to show you something to take it to the next level just a little bit. And that is the drosh. And where have we heard this before? Now, we had already begun to look at where we had heard some of these things before. But it's interesting that, and this is what you're supposed to do, is look forward. You realize that a lot of us were looking forward in the timeline. We were taking the things about the Book of Ruth and we were projecting them forward into the New Testament. But if a person who is reading this before the New Testament was written, before the advent of the Messiah, what might they read this and say, where have I heard this before? Because we've heard it before, but in a future tense. What if they were reading this and looking in a past tense? Where might they have heard this before?
They would have the Leviticus, Deuteronomy.
Yeah, they would have had the Torah and maybe a couple scrolls of, the prophets hadn't really been writing yet. This is before the advent of Samuel. This is before all those prophets who came around. Almost all of the prophets in the Old Testament were writing during the time of the Babylonian or the or the northern tribe in exile. So at this time period in history, you really would have only the Torah, maybe the book of Job, a couple of extraneous writings. King David wasn't even born. So what in the Torah would you look back on perhaps and say, where have we heard this before? Can you think of anything?
Just the ones that we already mentioned, like about the reaping in the corners of the field and all that.
Yep, reaping in the corners of the field. Huh?
Reaping of stones.
What did you say?
Never mind, it was cleaning.
Oh, okay. Gleaning, yes. Angela mentioned Rahab. That would have been in the book of Joshua, which certainly would have been around for a while. So that's one thing for sure. Consider this. And we're going to go on a little rabbi trail here for a moment. And they settled there. Leave your father's house. Sarai was barren. Okay, I'm going to show you that there's quite a few connections to this story and Abraham. Now, I want to show you something that this is a tangled mess, and there's a little nugget of Jewish tradition in here. You see if you can feel it. See what you think. According to Jewish tradition, here is the family tree of Terah, Abraham's father. Here's Abraham's father. He gives birth to 3 sons, Avram, Nahor, and Haran. It says in Genesis 11 that Haran died in the presence of his father while they were still in the land of Ur of the Kasdim. Now what's interesting is the text clearly says that Nahor married the daughter of Haran, Milcah, right? That's pretty clear. But then it also says that Haran their father died, and he had another daughter named Iscah, and he had a son named Lot. Now, what's interesting is that according to Jewish tradition, Iscah, they don't know what that, if you look in your Strong's Concordance, it might give you an idea, but it's really indeterminate. It's the only time this word is ever used, and they don't really know what it means. According to Jewish tradition, this word means princess. Now, what do we know about Sarah? It means my princess. When her name is changed to not from Sarai to Sarah, it is like some kind of like the princess of many or something like that. I don't remember how that translated. But what they actually are saying is Ishka is Sarai. It's the same person. And this is interesting because here we have the same situation where a brother dies and the brothers marry the daughters in order to perpetuate the name of the dead brother. And we have a problem because Sarai is barren. She is not able to fulfill that role of being kind of like a levirate marriage and a kinsman redeemer for the dead Haran. Now this gets quite fascinating because you notice that it says that Abraham and his father and his brother and all these little clan moved out of Ur of the Kasdim, and it says that they were on their way to where? The land of Canaan. Only what happened? They didn't get that far. They stopped in northern Syria in a place called Haran, which is not the same word, and they didn't make it. What does that remind you of? They started the journey and didn't quite get there. That's Orpah. Orpah started the journey with Naomi but didn't finish it. Ruth did. All of these people left the land of Ur of the Kasdim under Babylon with Nicodemus, Nimrod, excuse me. They left Haran and were on their way to the land of Canaan and didn't make it. They got waylaid in Haran and they stayed there. But then God appears to Abraham and says, leave your father's house and your land and your people and go to the land that I will show you, which is remarkably similar language to what we hear happening with Ruth. She leaves her father's house and her gods and her family, and she goes to the land of Canaan. So it's not called the land of Canaan anymore. Now, this interesting thing, it says that when they got to Haran, they settled there. You know that phrase is only used in one other location in the Bible. When the people landed in the plain of Shinar, and they settled there, and what did they do? They built a tower. They built a name for themselves, which is a contrast to what Abraham is doing. He is seeking to not build a name for himself, but by marrying his brother's daughter in order to perpetuate the name of his dead brother, he's seeking to build up the name of another. And that is so tied in with the book of Ruth. It's fascinating to me, the comparisons that you can see. Once you start digging a little bit below the surface of this book, you'll notice that there's a lot of similarities with Abraham and Sarah and Ruth and Naomi. It's quite interesting. There's some very good instruction regarding these comparisons if you go online and watch some different teachings about Ruth from a Jewish perspective and why they talk about Ruth on Shavuot. This is a big reason why, because they see those parallels. Now, I think that's quite fascinating. Do you have any comments, questions, or concerns about this little connection, Tracy?
Just another, where we've heard this before kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
What you were saying is it kind of reminded me of the Exodus too, because they would have that Torah information.
Yeah.
So this idea of leaving your gods and
Yep.
joining yourself with the Israelites and with God, because they came out with a mixed multitude.
Absolutely. It's the same deal. It's just the same deal keeps happening and repeating over and over and over. I mean, Abraham was a Gentile. When he left his people and his land, he was fully a Gentile. He wasn't a Jew, although you'll commonly heard him referred to as the first Jew. But he's not a Jew. He's an Aramean. He's a Babylonian, essentially. But what's that?
He's a called out one.
He's a called out Babylonian.
This word church, is ecclesia, is the called out one.
That's right. He is called out of those people and called to leave his father and mother and family and gods and all that stuff. Did you want to say something, Angela?
Does going mean without covenant?
I have heard that before. I will neither confirm nor deny that, but I have heard it. I mean, if you look at it from a base perspective from the Hebrew perspective, there are only two groups of people. There's a Hebrew and there's a Goyim, Gentile. And the only difference between them is these are the chosen people who are in covenant with God. So in a sense, yes, you could say that a Gentile is one who does not have a covenant with God.
And that's totally biblical when you look at we have understanding of who are God's people.
Yeah.
Because in Jeremiah 31, he says, "This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel in those days. I will put my law in their hearts and their minds.
Yep.
They will be my people. I will be their God." And this
Yeah.
is, when you look everywhere where he says, "I will be their God, they will be my people," it has to do with them walking like Ruth. Your God will be my God. I will do,
Right.
what you do type of situation.
Right.
And then you got the people who are not my people.
Right.
And we see in Hosea, you are not my people. Why? Because you did not keep that covenant. Now
Right.
you're outside of that. So really, anybody who is outside of Israel are
Right.
not his people.
Right.
So when you join yourself to Israel, you are my people and your God.
Right, absolutely. And that's something that we discussed at length in the very beginning of this book, which is being grafted into God's people. And that's a problem for a lot of Gentiles because, and isn't that just interesting that God's people would be so hated in the world? Why would you want to become one of those people? You know what I'm saying? That's a challenge. That's a real challenge. If you look at the Jews in history, they've been hated and persecuted in every place they've ever been. And yet, the Paul and the apostles are traveling all over the world saying, "Join us." And what's even more interesting is that they did. But then it became passé to be joining them, and they thought, well, there's more of us than there are of them, so we'll just change the flavor of it so that we don't look like them anymore. And unfortunately, that's what happened. And so we want to join Israel's God, we just don't want to join Israel. And that's a problem. And frankly, I think it's more of a problem because the Jews have corrupted God's word, and the Christians have corrupted God's word. And when you do things I like to say, do Bible things in Bible ways, you might end up looking like a Jew. You might end up looking like a Christian sometimes, but you're going to stand out. You're not going to look like a regular Jew, and you're not going to look like a regular Christian. You're going to be rejected from both sides, unfortunately. If you do Bible things in Bible ways, the Christians will reject you, and the Jews will reject you. Now, what does that sound like to you? I'm going to glorify in that because it sounds like a faithful remnant to me. I want to be a member of the faithful remnant. I don't want to be somebody who does Christian things in Christian ways, loosely defined. I don't want to be a Jewish person who does Jewish things. I want to be a person who reads the Bible and does what it says. I want to do Bible things in Bible ways, but that'll make you stick out. That'll make you stick out these days. So there's a bit of darash. Looking at where have we heard this before and what kind of, and we could spend a lot of time on this right here just now that we've kind of gleaned what are these words mean and where have we heard them before. Man, you could spend a lot of time just continuing to dig down that hole and see all these connections and then begin to inform that text. We don't have a lot of time to do that this evening, but I wanted to just spark your interest and whet your appetite perhaps to begin to think about some of these things and dig a little bit deeper. Now, going on to the next level, and this is where you get into the mysterious. Did you know, and maybe you didn't, that all of the verses in Ruth start with the letter Vav, except 8 of them? I think both of those things are significant. The fact that every single verse in this book starts with Vav, except 8. Which 8?
Yeah, to say
We looked at that. Yes, we did. Angela and I spent a little time pulling out which of these verses did not start with Vav and looking at perhaps, now frankly I got to tell you, we weren't able to see it at this time. Maybe there's something there, maybe there's not, I don't know. But I will say that there's significance to the letter Vav because something happens in the next chapter which is very significant of the letter Vav, and we will talk about that in just a moment. Not in a moment, probably next week, because I don't think we're going to get there. But then again, the letter 8. I mean, what do we know about the letter 8? What's that? Yeah, like new beginnings. This is like the Shemini Atzeret festival, which is coming up here in just a couple of months. On October 21st. That letter 8 represents the one that comes right after 7, a new beginning. So think about that. And this is one of those mysterious things that's buried in the text somewhere that you wouldn't even notice it. If you don't read Hebrew, you wouldn't notice it at all. I wouldn't have noticed it. But yeah, all the verses in Ruth start with Vav except for 8 of them. So look at that if you want to and take a deeper look. It's quite fascinating. But I will deal with that in a little bit, that Vav issue. It's quite fascinating. Now, leaving father, mother, fields, and gods, okay? Ruth is commended by Boaz because of her actions, not because of what she believed, but because of what she did. And I think that this is very informative for us because you have heard, I know, many times people say that bad company corrupts good morals, right? The people that you surround yourself with in life are the ones that will trip you up faster than anything else. If any of you have some backstory where you got involved in whether it was premarital sex or drugs or alcohol or whatever it was that's in your past, I can guarantee you probably that 99% of you would say it was this person or this group of people that I was hanging out with at the time that influenced me. Now, maybe you were weak of character. Maybe you were one of those people who was influencing others. I don't know. But the people that we surround ourselves with are so crucial. They are so crucial. And I think that this is a big part of becoming a true Israelite. And that is leaving behind those things in your life that are not good for you. And oftentimes that means people. And oftentimes, most painfully, that means family. That has been a real challenging one. I know that whether it's a Hebrew roots thing or it's a doing Bible things in Bible ways, family issues become really prominent. I know all of you have family members who have said, you're absolutely nuts. I don't know what you're doing. Well, it's because you're doing Bible things in Bible ways. And I got to tell you that we have to be willing to leave father and mother and homeland and you know, our gods that we had before. And I know that that sounds ridiculous, but in a sense it's not, because perhaps the God that we thought we knew was not really the God of the Bible. The Jesus that we thought we knew is not really the Jesus of the Bible. We just heard about Jesus from these different man-made sources around the internet and in some of our commentaries, and we thought we understood this stuff until we started reading it for ourselves, and we got a little bit of a deeper understanding. Not terribly deep, but just looking at the original languages can tell you a lot. You start looking at this Jesus in the Bible, and you're thinking, this Jesus is a little different than the one that I thought that I knew. And that's a big thing. But the people in your life can be very dangerous, or they can be very uplifting. They can be very helpful. They can be encouraging. They can guide you and help you and lead you. And I know that that's a huge issue for all of us. Whether there's poisonous people in your life or whether there's just people who are confronting you on various issues, it might consider thinking, what can I do here? I don't know. And I'm not telling you to kick your family to the curb. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying if there's poisonous relationships, definitely kick those to the curb. Definitely kick those to the curb. Because people will...
Put them on the outer bands.
Put them on the outer bands. That is correct. You got to be careful regarding the people that you associate with. Angela, are you smirking at me for a reason?
We'll talk later. It just occurred to me.
Uh-oh. I may have to cut someone off. Tracy?
I think I have another sod thing, but I don't know
Please.
if you're going to keep talking. I don't want to.
No, you go right ahead.
And I don't know if you talked about it last time when we were.
I don't know.
But the name of Naomi, you talked about what her name
Pleasant,
is.
yeah.
Pleasant or beauty. When you look at the root word, there's a reference in Zechariah. So we know that Naomi's of Judah,
Yeah.
right? So that I think she could be representing on this mysterious picture, the two tribes kind of thing. Now she's literally of Judah, but her name means pleasant. In Zechariah, there's another little parable about these two groups of people. Yahweh says he'll name one band, the other beauty. That word beauty is Naomi's name, the root of her name, and that's Judah, and the other one's Israel. So I think we see Ruth representing that other side. And so when you look at the big picture of what Judah was left in Israel for David's sake to do in Jerusalem was to draw the nations to God, so that your God will be my God.
Right.
That whole situation. So we see a good example of that actually happening.
Yeah.
The way it's meant to. And then Boaz also representing this house, this picture of them doing this and drawing them back to the Father instead of becoming like the Gentiles.
And even Naomi herself, and that's another awesome picture, that Naomi herself is being redeemed in this story. In fact, the story is really about Naomi. Ruth is obviously a central character, but it's really about Naomi herself being redeemed. Remember that she is experienced going away full and coming back empty and bitter. And we'll talk about this in just a moment. It's coming right up. But note, well, we'll get there in just a sec. But yes, you're absolutely right.
What you said is good, because that's also illustrating the fact how Judah needs Avram or Israel,
Absolutely.
Gentile, Christian, whatever you want it to be.
Absolutely.
They need each other.
Yeah.
We can really see that in the story.
And you can see it especially coming up in the next chapter, where Ruth actually witnesses to Naomi. And Naomi starts her transition from bitterness back to pleasantness.
Wow.
She starts that transition. And it's quite fascinating. It's coming right up. And I hope we'll get to it this evening. Angela?
Well, the redemption thing in the field, the field is mentioned right at the beginning. The serpent and most clever of the field.
Yep.
So if this whole redemption, I think redemption is so huge. I mean, on the scale of redemption is so huge, because here you have Naomi, that's Judah. Her redemption linked to, now, in order to redeem Ruth, he redeemed what? The land, the field. It's not land, it's field. So he redeems the field, and Ruth, it's a package deal. Ruth comes with it, and the result is Naomi is redeemed as well.
Yep.
So you have this redemption that just, it's
Yeah.
just the whole
Yep.
deal.
Absolutely. And the land is a big part of it. The field, the land is a big part of
The
that.
field, the world, yeah.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
So
Great.
that's why I think that his redemption is not. We hear about the remnant, and I think that's a key piece. But I suspect that the redemption thing extends further than any of us dream.
Sure, absolutely.
Do you think it has also a little bit to do with, or my question is actually, for what would it mean that Boaz then also says, from okay, guys, the reapers, always confused those two, reapers and cleaners, throw a little bit extra that she can also reap more.
Yep.
Do you think that has a significant?
Absolutely, I do. That, and I think that's part of my, that's part of my next point, actually, and I'll deal with that right now. Notice the reward of God when Boaz testifies regarding Naomi. He recites, I have heard, I have understood what you have done, and that you left all this, and you took care of your mother-in-law, and you have come to seek shelter under the wings of Yehovah. Interesting, too, that word wings is kanaf. You've heard that before. What is that? That's the corners of your garment where you wear tzitzit. Okay, it's the same word. You hear that when Yehovah takes them out of Egypt. He said, man, I carried you, put you under my wings like an eagle when I brought you out of Egypt. This is talking about the redemption of his people. And I think that this picture, as you were saying, John, and as Tracy was saying also, that when that her life becomes so much easier at this point. Not just because she found, precisely because she found a good field to glean in. That Boaz says to her, man, I want you to sit down and eat with us. And he gives her roasted grain and bread to eat. And she has so much left over, she has leftovers to take to her mother-in-law. Reminds me of Yeshua talking about your cup being filled and pressed and pushed down and overflowing. And taking out parts and just leave it for her. Like, let it lay on the ground and pretend like you forgot it. Even take some out and throw it. Life has become so much easier for her. So much easier for her. And I think, and I've said this to you before, but I want to repeat it because I think it needs to be kept in mind, and that is that this is the precise reason that the commandments of God were given, for blessings. Redemption, salvation, does not happen because you keep God's commandments. That is not what they're for. They are for blessing. And you've heard me say before, and I stole it from someone else, I don't even remember who, that when you are a redeemed person and you are obedient, it's like having oil in your engine. Your gears aren't grinding. Things aren't happening badly for you. Yes, you will still face the challenges of life, but you have grace to deal with the challenges of life. The things that would normally beat someone down and make them despair won't happen to you because you have a peace in the midst of your most challenging circumstances. I know that each of you as a redeemed person has testimony that you would give regarding some of the most challenging and difficult portions of your life that you've had to deal with, that you can, in hindsight, of course, look back and say, God was with me. I don't know how I made it through that. It was really challenging, but I do know that as I look back on it this year later, these 2 years later, these 10 or 20 years later, that I know that God was with me, that somehow I made it through that, and even in the midst of it, I had this certain sense of peace about me that I don't even know how. That is that peace that surpasses all comprehension. That is the reward of faithfulness. Life becomes easier. I think, unfortunately, that we have done a great disservice to many a new believer by leading them to believe that if they just come down to the front of the altar and say a prayer, that life is going to get easier. That's not necessarily so. Obedience is where blessing comes from, not confession. Confession is the start of that process. Getting down to doing the altar call and saying, I am a sinner and I need forgiveness, that's step one. The blessings come because of obedience and faithfulness to God. Life gets a little easier. I totally believe that. And I know that there's an outlier. I know that there are, but it's the exception that proves the rule. Tracy?
That whole picture of obedience, like literally, and in the Hebrew text, that word shu, not that it's this idea of returning. So here's me going this way away from the face of God, and I'm going to say this prayer now, and I mean it, and I want to turn from my sin. Well, now I'm facing God.
Yep.
Obedience is when I start walking toward God.
Right.
If I'm not doing that, then I'm just standing here.
Right.
And that's, I think what James talks about. Is,
Yep.
Work with all of this faith is dead. You're not moving. You're not progressing.
Absolutely. And I think it really also relates to, interestingly enough, the Gospel of John in chapter 15, where it's talking about the vine, and I am the vine and you are the branches. Saying, those who are in me and are not bearing fruit, what does the text say? Quite fascinating. You know that we have three things going on in that parable of the vine. If you're not bearing fruit, it says, most of your translations say he will pull you out, take you away. Do you know that is very likely not what that says? The Greek word how there's like lists of definitions. It could mean this, it could mean that, it could mean this, it could mean that. The last definition means remove. All of the ones before that mean lift up. Lift up. So, you have three elements. One branch is not bearing any fruit. Could be removed, could be lifted up. The other branch that is bearing fruit, what happens to it? It's pruned so that it will bear more fruit. Then there are those branches who are not in him. They get thrown into the fire. So, I see three elements there. Those who are abiding, but are not obedient, and need help. They need to be lifted up. Or they could be in danger of becoming not in him, then pulled off and thrown into the fire. But I think God is gracious. And you know this from experience, that if you're willing to acknowledge him and turn and get that first step of the process going, that's awesome. And he will lift you up. He will help you to help you on that journey. But you're going to have to join the fight at some point. If you don't, you could be in danger of no longer being in him and being cast off and thrown into the fire and burned. But I think the first step is lifting up. Not, I got a branch in me, so text what it says. And there's a very clear distinction between in me and not in me. If it says that this branch is in him, but it's not bearing any fruit, I think God is gracious enough to lift it up, help it a little bit. And let's see what happens. Possible. Just something to think about. Angela?
On a practical level, isn't that what you see happening with grapevines? They need to be off the ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
That's
we tacked ours to the wall.
yeah.
And those grape fields that were out there,
Yep.
they lift them off the ground.
Yeah, and I'm a terrible, terrible farmer. I don't really have a green thumb, but yes, I would say that's undoubtedly true, that grapevines, from what I can tell, they don't grow on the ground. They don't grow well on the ground. They got to be up and attached to wires, up off the ground. So it's just something to think about. But I think that this demonstrates in Ruth, that Boaz testifies regarding her faithfulness and her good works, her good deeds, and he blesses her. Gives her tremendous blessings. Mikey?
I think there might also be a kind of a loose connection with the wings here because, as you indicated, that's where the tzitzit goes, the reminder, the commands. It's the same word for the wings, the cherubim, that's over the mercy seat where the commands go.
Yep.
And we see this other picture that you had pointed out about her staying in this place.
Right.
Go elsewhere.
Right.
And that's what the commands do, right?
Yep.
It's a hedge of protection.
Yep.
And that is why she is getting blessed, because she's under these commands.
Yep.
And in the next chapter, not to go too deep, but that same word is used when she says to put his skirt.
Exactly right. That word is used twice in this gospel, as far as I remember, and one is right here, and the other when she says, "Put your skirt, over, put your covering over me." Absolutely, very, very good insight.
And that's something I think Yahovah does in, let's say, Ezekiel 16, maybe, when he is with Jerusalem, when he says, "I saw you in your blood, and I covered you with my spirit."
Yes, right.
And then Messiah says, when he's here on the earth, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I wish I could gather you, your children under my wings. But you
Yep.
don't have it.
Yep, absolutely. Awesome insights. I want to just cover one more thing before, we're going to get to chapter 3. We're not going to get to chapter 3 tonight, but we're approaching right here at the end of chapter 2, and I just want to cover this one final thing before we wrap up, and we'll get to chapter 3 next time. And it is actually in this section. I didn't remember whether it was, but the witness of Ruth to Naomi. You notice that Naomi sees her, and what is the first thing she says? When Ruth comes home and Naomi sees her, what does she say? "Where were you? Who blessed you so much?" Ruth doesn't even have a chance to say anything yet, and already Naomi can see that something is different. And it's probably because she is incredibly blessed. She's got her pouch full of leftover bread. She's carrying a huge sack on her back that's so full of grain that, where did you get this? Did you knock over a liquor store? So you can see that Naomi is seriously impressed by the blessing that Ruth has come home with. What does that say to you? It says to me that your actions speak louder than your words. When this is precisely why, I don't remember which it was, whether it was Peter or John, who said, "Let your good deeds shine before men, so that they may know that you are sons of your Father." Be ready for someone to ask you what is the reason for the hope that is in you. They can see your life and see the blessings that are happening in your life, and they can say, "Man, what are you doing so right? What's going on in your life that things are going well for you?" They might be angry, but someone who has a heart to hear from God might say, "Whatever you've got, I want that. I want that because I can see something in you." That's what that text says to me, is that Naomi sees something in Ruth right away. And then Ruth opens her mouth and says, "I went and saw Boaz, the kinsman redeemer." That's such a beautiful picture of you living your life according to God's commandments and Him blessing you and all the people around you saying, "Man, what's going on with you?" And then you open your pie hole and you say, "I met the kinsman redeemer. Let me tell you about what He's done in my life." And we've talked about that many times before. If you don't have that experience of God having transformed your life and changed you and begun to bless you, then it's hard for you to give a personal witness. You might say, "Man, I started reading this book." That's great. You got to start somewhere. But that's not nearly as powerful as saying, "Let me tell you what I know about this God, because I have experienced it. I didn't just read about it in a book. I have experienced it." And I think that just that witness of Ruth to Naomi, and that goes even deeper, like to that sowed level that you began to speak about there a minute ago, Tracy, regarding if we're going to say that Naomi perhaps is a spiritual picture of the people of God who have begun to be unfaithful and had begun to be bitter in their hearts, and Naomi, as this Gentile person, is grafted in and then begins to witness back to the original individual, and she begins to be praising God. She says, "Blessed by Yehovah is the one who blessed you." Then it just brings even more of this spiritual picture of Jews and Gentiles. This grafted in Gentile who then goes right back and witnesses to the Jewish brother who says, let me tell you about the kinsman redeemer. But if your actions don't comport with what you're saying, then that person who's listening to you says, I don't think so. I don't think so.
I think we see some of that too in the life of Messiah when, he'd be with Jewish people, but then it was these Gentiles that were like being examples to these Israelites at the time. So like these ones that had this great faith, he doesn't even see in Israel.
Right.
One of which reminds me of Ruth specifically is the one that says, come and heal my daughter.
Right.
And they're like, send her away.
Yeah.
Because it's not good for me to give the children's food to
Dogs.
And
Yeah.
she said even the dogs eat the crumbs from the master's table, which reminds me of the gleaning of the fields. It's like,
Absolutely.
what's left.
Perfect.
And he's saying what faith you have and it shall be done for you.
Yep. Perfect
So
example.
it's almost like I'm seeing too is like the Jewish people generalizing, maybe becoming bitter or not so much bitter, but losing hope. Where's this Messiah? Where is this Messiah? They're still clinging to their faith, but then we've got like the Ruth type of person coming in, and this Gentile person saying, "Here he is,"
Yeah.
and that's this, and then they see that. Wait a minute, this matches up with what I've always known.
Yeah.
And it's this joining of the two.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just amazing. It's just amazing stuff. I think when you look at this idea of hostility in another field as well, this kind of, I'll just tell you something that this occurred to me, and I think that's, I'm just going to deal with hostility in the field because that's really all the time we have. But I want to say this. To me, this keeps coming back to me, and I don't know why. It could be totally wrong, and you can totally disagree with me, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. When I looked at hostility in the field, it was almost like Ruth was being told by Boaz, look, it's a dangerous, crazy world out there. You could get harassed by other people, and he mentions that twice. I want you to stay among the family. I want you to stay here. You'll be safe here. I can take care of you. Now, you might say that that's one way of saying, well, don't get involved in the world. And that's a perfectly good idea to bring to this text, to say, stick with the family. Don't be too wrapped up in the world. That's totally fine. But it also reminds me of this idea of personal evangelism, okay? Because I looked back at the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts when he begins to go on his missionary journeys. And I want to point out to you, and I pointed this out just a little bit when we were in the book of Acts a couple of months ago, that we noted that when Paul went out on his first missionary journey, he went to 3 places. I don't remember the names of the 3 places, and they're not terribly significant at this point. He went to 3 places, and then he came back to Antioch of Syria. The first place, it says, he went to this synagogue, and he preached the gospel of Yeshua to these Jews. And it says that there was a ton of people who believed, and the whole city practically turned out on the next day, and then there began to be a little bit of pushback, just a hint of pushback. The next time he goes out, he goes to another Jewish synagogue. And this time, there's more pushback. Some of these unbelieving Jews began to push back even further. The third place that he visited, he's in a completely Gentile situation. And he speaks the word about Yeshua, and what he heals this guy, and the guy jumps up and starts, walking, and what happens? These Gentiles get all excited and decide to sacrifice to the god Zeus. And it literally does not say that anyone accepted Yeshua. Did you realize that? Now, this is so illustrative for me because it tells me that where is the greatest need in the body of the Messiah? It's actually in the body of the Messiah. It's not out there in the world. Now, I know that there are people who are called as apostles and teachers and preachers and evangelists. There are people whose job it is to go out there into the wide world and bring people into a covenant with God. But I think too much of the time we have been so enamored, and Angela has spoken about this before, we get so excited about what's going on out there that we trip over the need that is right in front of us. And so I think it's illustrative that Paul went to the Jews first, twice, and had a really good response. But then when he went to the Gentiles, the first time he went to the Gentiles, they mixed his message with the religion of false gods and were about to sacrifice to Zeus and Hermes on his behalf. And the text literally does not say that anyone believed. They got really excited about it, and then they took the truth and they mixed it with their own religion. And what a beautiful picture that is of exactly what happened. Now, am I saying don't evangelize? No, of course I'm not. But unfortunately, the people who need real evangelism are the people in the church. The people that who are Christian, but are not experiencing the power of God in their lives. They're not experiencing this blessing of Ruth. Their lives are a continuous and constant struggle, and they're not experiencing that redeemed salvation that we're talking about here. That, I think, is what's so critical, is that the family of God itself is lame and crippled and blind. And Yeshua talks about that in the book of the Revelation. When he goes through those 7 letters to the 7 churches, every single one of them has some issue. Some of them have a whole lot of issues. That he says you are pitiable and naked and blind and deaf and dumb. You have no idea what's going on. That, to me, is what this passage is talking about. Just throwing it out there.
It's challenging, too, though, because kind of what we talked about earlier with the impact this information has versus just the knowledge, right?
Yep.
Like, the unbelieving population are very receptive to some of this because it makes sense. There's a lot of things
That's
that
true.
just make sense, right?
Yep.
But they don't necessarily really believe it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But then you've got the religious groups, Jew and Christian, that are very religious and are very offended by what God's word says. So it's tough.
Isn't that fascinating, though, that it's exactly like it was in the first century?
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why I've said this before, and it's just so ironic that exactly what Jesus was going around saying to the religious leaders in his day is exactly what he will probably say to them in our day. You are terribly, terribly religious, and yet terribly, terribly worthless as a God-fearing individual who's doing what I told you to do. That sucks. That is so challenging, but you're right. I have found, and I know that probably many of you have as well, that you talked about your newfound understanding after having actually read your Bible, and you go to talk to somebody who really doesn't have any background in religion at all, and you start talking to them about it, you're like, wow, that makes more sense to me than anything I've ever heard. Because it does. It makes good sense. God makes sense. He's not a God of chaos. And yet, the religious folk that you come in contact with, that's where your pushback is coming from people who think they already know. And that's exactly like it was in the days of Yeshua and Paul. They got the most pushback from people who thought they already knew. There's nothing worse than thinking you already know. We need to guard ourselves against that. Always thinking we already know something. And I know that many of us have become puffed up. I'll speak to myself specifically, having come into this knowledge of, starting to read this stuff and go, man, there's so many interesting things. It's real easy to get puffed up and think you got a corner on the truth now. We need to remain humble and say, man, I have learned a tiny nugget that has really changed my life. But it's powerful. It really is. But it presents a real conundrum for us because you want to go to the house of God because it's like preaching to the choir. It's easier. But you know what? That's where all you came from. As far as I know, there's only maybe one person here who didn't have any background in religion, but I heard, the gospel and it made sense to me and here I am. But the rest of you, God called you out of this religious group and showed you that you need to read His Word and see what it says and start doing it. So yeah, it's a tough situation. But I think you're going to experience hostility in any field you go to. But this field, so I see what you're saying, Mikey. In fact, in this field, you're probably going to get more hostility than in going into another field. But what a challenging situation. I don't have anything else for you. I'm going to wrap up. It's time. Any questions, comments, or concerns? I apologize for lingering in chapter 2 for a lengthy period of time, but it was a good talk, I think. We'll get to chapter 3 next time. I promise. Let's pray.